All right, things are looking good. Welcome, everyone. This is Exodus. This class is with Rabbi Silber as he continues his ongoing series covering the first two books of Tanakh. In a careful study of the story of Exodus, including the 10 plagues, the journey out of Egypt, the Song of the Sea, all as preludes to the challenging path of freedom. Rabbi David Silber is the founder and dean of Drisha. He is a musmach of Reitz Seminary. He is the recipient of the Covenant Award, a lecturer on the Bible, and an author. In today's class, the sources will be shared on screen from Sefaria, but if you have your own Tanakh that you prefer, please feel welcome to keep it at hand, and Rabbi Silber will call out psukim. We very much want to hear your questions. Please do not hesitate to ask in chat, either on Zoom or on Facebook. And if you accept an invitation to participate, which I will send out again in a few minutes once things get underway, you can unmute yourself, ask questions directly, and show your face. And with that, I want to hand things over to Rabbi Silber.
Okay, thank you, Caleb. All right, let us begin. We are in the middle of looking at the 10 plagues. So last week, we discussed the plagues that are recorded in 3 different places. One is the Torah, of course, in our story, Sefer Shemot. But then it was interesting to look at 2 of the Psalms that we have, so-called historical Psalms, Psalm 78 and Psalm 105, that in the context of those Psalms, it mentions the plagues. And what was very interesting is, first of all, there don't seem to be 10. And second of all, the order of the plagues seems to be somewhat different in each of the Psalms, and that we discussed last week, and I'm not going to go over that again. In any event, that was what we saw last week, sort of an overview of the plagues. I wanted this morning, here in the morning anyway, here in New York, is to look at just briefly 3 of the 10 plagues and to comment on 3 of the 10. So I wanted to begin with the 4th plague. In the Torah, the 4th plague is called Arov, and this is found in chapter 8, in the beginning of the 16th pasuk. We have plague number 4, Arov. So let us begin with that. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, Hashkem baboker v'yatsev l'fnei Paro, hinei yotzei hamayma, v'yomer Toilov, kol mar Hashem, shalach ami v'yavduni. So that's this is parallel to the first plague, where Moshe is told to sort of intercept Paro as he goes to the water. Probably means to the Nile.
Rabbi Silber?
Yes.
You're currently cut off by your screen. Can you move more towards the center? And see. A little bit more. You're not better. More towards put your face in the center.
I can't see myself on the screen. If I could see myself, I could do it. I'm always seeing you.
Okay, move a little to your left.
Is that better?
That's better. Thank you.
Okay, fine. All right. In any event, this is parallel to the first plague. Again, Moshe was told to intercept Paro on his way to probably to the Nile, and tell him, again, Kol Amar Hashem. Kol Amar Hashem, thus says God, is, of course, found in the prophetic writings very often, a kind of prophetic utterance in God's name. Here we have Kol Amar Hashem, Shalach ami v'yavduni. I just didn't want to gloss over those 3 words. Those are very significant. Shalach ami v'yavduni. Let my people go v'yavduni, and they will serve me. To be an eved, to be a servant. So God's desire is that the people be God's servants. Avdei Hashem. One might say, up to this point or present, they are Pharaoh's servants. Avodim hayinu l'Pharaoh b'Mitzrayim. Pharaoh had said to Moshe, who first asked him for a 3-day journey into the desert to bring sacrifices, Pharaoh said, "No way, we can't afford that. There are too many of them. Tichbada avodah. Let the slavery be even more severe. Tichbada avodah." He sees the Israelites as his avodim. What God is saying over here, Shalach ami v'yavduni, they have to serve me. So here the Torah already has set up a conflict between Paro on one hand and between God on the other. And it raises the question that the book will deals with in the beginning and certainly at the end of the book. We touched upon it, and maybe in the future delve more deeply into it. What is the difference between being a servant of God and a servant of Pharaoh? We noted in the beginning of our study, one difference is that when you're a servant for Pharaoh, there's no days off. There's no Shabbat. You have to constantly work. When it comes to being God's avodim and building God's house, the work that one does for God, of course, the Torah emphasizes at the end of this book the idea of the Shabbat. You work 6 days, you build the Mishkan, you build in God's house, you serve God, but there is the Shabbat. There is the day which you don't work. But there are many other differences as well. We have to keep this in mind. Just the other day, I was at a talk on Shabbat, and again, in terms of the Seder, the Haggadah, talked a bit about being an Eved Hashem, and the relationship between it, Avdei Hashem on one hand, and being an Eved for someone else. And in that context, I spoke up just very, for a moment, and I pointed out that on Pesach, we have been reciting the Hallel, the Hallel prayer, the Psalms 113 to 118, we call Hallel. And in that, one of the Psalms, Ma'ashiv Hashem, how should I repay God's kindnesses? How do I show gratitude? And the psalmist says, the person speaking in the psalm says, Ono Hashem ki ani avdecha, ani avdecha ben amotecha. Oh God, I am your servant, your Eved. Avdecha ben amotecha, I'm your servant, the son of your female servant. Pitachta l'mosei rai, you have loosened my fetters. Pitachta l'mosei rai, you've unchained me. You freed me. I think I said it's an interesting verse to reflect on in the Hallel, that being a servant of God, the child of a servant. Pitachta l'mosei rai, you have freed me. I think the idea there is that if one is truly an Eved Hashem, if one feels that one must respond to God, one must do what is right in God's eyes, if that's the way you live your life, then essentially, in a certain sense, you are free. It doesn't mean people can't oppress you. Of course, it doesn't mean that. But it means from a psychological standpoint, you don't see yourself as someone else's servant. You see yourself only as God's servant. You answer only to God. That's what we say in Hallel all the time. I just wanted to make this clear. This Shalach ami v'yavduni, which is repeated within the context of the plagues, is an incredibly important statement. There, God says straight out, I'm going to free them, but they're going to become my servants. You're my servants. They will be my avadim. Specifically over here, though, we know that when Moshe says in God's name, Shalach ami v'yavduni, he has a particular reference point, namely the idea of asking permission to leave Mitzrayim, go into the desert, and to serve God, that is to bring sacrifices to God, right? So Vachnu Hashem Elokeinu, etc. Exactly. So that's the request which was made once already, and Moshe is now told to repeat this request with the warning. As we continue reading now in chapter 8, in the 17th pasuk, Ki meincha mishalech et ami, if you don't do it, so that God understands that, tell Paro, if you don't do it. That's the way God speaks to Paro. I will send against you, if you don't let them go, I will let loose. And now we have the word, what will God let loose? So the answer is arov. Now the question is, what is arov? What does arov mean? And the commentaries are actually disagree about what arov might mean. Arov probably means, the word arov means a mixture. The only question is, a mixture of what? So, for example, I see here in the JPS translation, I will let loose swarms of insects. And then on the bottom is a note, others, wild beasts. I mean, I think the interpretation I was first was taught was it's animals, arov is animals, but we pointed this out last week as well. It could be insects. It could be things that come in swarms. When you think about a swarm, you might think about a swarm of bees. You would say a swarm of elephants. You know, insects come in swarms. In any event, there's some kind of insect or animal that will come in swarms and will come against you, your servants, your people, your houses. Right. And on the ground of which they are. And then in the next pasuk, interestingly enough, Vifleiti bayomahu et eretz Goshen, asher ami omed oleha, vivilti heyot sham arov. But I will hifleiti, I will distinguish, I will set apart on that very time when these swarms are coming. Let's assume swarms of animals. When they're coming, I'm going to set apart the land of Goshen, which my people are on. Remember that Joseph had brought his family to Goshen to be close to Joseph. V'man teda ki ani Hashem b'kerev haaretz, in order that you know that I am God in the midst of the land. We mentioned this last week, that before the first plague and before the fourth plague and before the seventh plague, a reason is given, and the reason is in order that you know. The first time was you know I exist, you know I am God. The second here in the fourth plague, before the fourth plague, in order that you know I am God in the midst of the land. I don't just exist somehow up there in the heavens. I exist in the land, that is to say, and I make divisions within the land. So the fourth plague, it's explicit that in the fourth plague, there's going to be a division, an obvious division between the land of Goshen, where the Israelites live, and the rest of Egypt, where the Israelites presumably do not live. Which raises the question, of course, this is plague number 4. What happened in plague number 1, plague number 2, and plague number 3? Are we to imagine that the first 3 plagues affected not only the Egyptians, but affected the Israelites as well? And indeed, some commentaries say that exactly, that the first 3 plagues, which one could say are more of a nuisance than this plague, seems more serious. If it's wild animals roaming through the land, swarms of animals, and even if it's insects, depends on what kind of insects, you know. The most dangerous creature on the face of earth is probably the mosquito. A little mosquito brings more disease than anything else. But whatever it is, it's something dangerous. But the first 3 plagues, one could argue, the plague of Dam, where the waters of Egypt turned to blood. And it's hard to imagine that the Israelites weren't affected by that. So it's Svardeya. So it seems like, depending on what Svardeya is, if we assume it's frogs per se are not that dangerous. They're a nuisance. They can die and become very smelly in heaps of frogs. But it's not, if Svardeya are frogs, which is I think the majority view, they're not per se dangerous. There's a view it might be crocodiles, but if it's frogs, maybe they went into the houses. Maybe the Israelites were affected by that as well. The third plague of kinim, of lice, again, it's a nuisance. It's not going to, damage you necessarily in some severe way, but it's a nuisance. So the first 3 plagues, some have argued, affected everybody. It's only here in the fourth plague that we have a distinction being made between, in the plague of Arov, which seems to be much more dangerous, between Israelites, the land of Goshen where Israel lives, and the other lands. I mean, it's not clear. Many Israelites live in Goshen. Certainly, we can't say that all the Israelites live in Goshen. So maybe the Israelites that lived in those other lands, they were affected. But the land of Goshen is set apart. That's one possibility, that the first 3 plagues affected everyone. Alternatively, and this is the view of the Ramban thinks no. The Ramban says that the plagues didn't affect the Israelites at all. But the first 3 plagues, it's not in a way such a great novelty. It's not so surprising that that it's not surprising that perhaps the Israelites could be spared. They're coming to a certain place, but Orov is a swarm, swarms of animals, swarms of insects, whatever it is. They presumably are swarming every which way. So that's a plague which logically should affect everyone. So here the Torah says no. Even though they are swarming around and are moving all around the land, nonetheless you will see that they do move all around the land, but somehow the land of Goshen they don't come to. That's the view
Rabbi
of the Ramban. Yes.
I just want to bring a question from the chat while it's still timely from Laszlo asking what I think is Bekerev Haaretz. Any reason why this Bekerev Haaretz? Any reason why this phrase is repeated in the blessing to Yosef's children?
I don't know. I have to think about it. It's a very good question, actually. I will. I was thinking about the blessing to Joseph's children for a completely different reason. So maybe I have to think that I want to get back to that in my own head, and I would try to respond. Yes, the blessing there was V'yidgula rov Bekerev Haaretz. It is an interesting thought. Okay, I'll leave that aside. Thank you for that question. If I have something intelligent to say, at least what I think is intelligent, I'll respond. Otherwise, we'll leave it until I have something to say. But I was thinking about the blessing of Yaakov to Joseph's children for a different reason, which I thought about in terms of the story over here. Maybe I'll try to come back to that. Okay, this is the fourth plague. This is Aro. Let's continue now. There's one very interesting verse here I wanted to discuss. Let's move on to the next pasuk, and I'll stop and take any and all questions. The next pasuk, verse number 19, right? So in other words, pedut is a difficult word. The commentaries, Rashi, Rashbam, exactly as we have here a difference, a distinction. I'm going to make a distinction between my people and your people. As I said before, and this is what God said, Ani Hashem Bekerev Haaretz, I'm going to make this distinction. Tomorrow, this will happen tomorrow. So in this particular plague, Paro was given some time to think about it. Perhaps because it's more serious. And Paro should consider this very seriously, and he's being told now, you have some time to consider what to do. This is not just a bunch of frogs or something, or lice. This is swarms of either animals or dangerous insects. So this is the, now let's continue the next verse. Vayas Hashem came, told in the next verse, in fact, God does this. It's verse number 20. Vayavo arov kavei, beita paro ubeita avadav, uv'chol eretz Mitzrayim tishachet aretz b'nei harov. So here we have it. In fact, as Moshe had said, God brings about this plague, arov kaved, a heavy plague, kaved. That's another word that appears throughout the whole story from beginning to end. We mentioned that in the past. So now, Vayikra Paro el Moshe uli Aaron, Vayomer v'chu zivchu Elohechem ba'aretz. Here we come to a very important. You got to scroll down. Here we come to a very important verse. Paro says to Moshe and Aaron, "Bring the sacrifices to God in the land." In other words, Moshe's request had been. Keep scrolling down. Moshe's request had been to serve our God. That was Moshe's request. Let us go out 3 days into the desert to serve God. It means to bring sacrifices, right? Our God demands that we serve God. And Paro refused to do it. And now Paro agrees. Well, no, he doesn't agree, but the request is, Paro says, you can sacrifice to God, but you can't go for a 3-day journey. Do it inside the land. But Moshe responds, Vayoma Moshe, lo nachon lasot kain. Ki toavat Mitzrayim nizbach Hashem Eloheinu, hein nizbach et toavat Mitzrayim u'eineihem v'lo yizkerunu. Moshe says to Paro, we can't do that. Can we sacrifice? Toavat Mitzrayim will be something that is an abomination for the Egyptians. We can't do this. The Egyptian people will not permit it. If we try to bring this sacrifice, slaughter animals in Egypt, the Egyptian people will be highly insulted, and they will see this as a very aggressive act, and they will actually kill us. Can we do this before their eyes, and they won't stone us? So Moshe says, your agreement to do it inside the land, that's not practical. That can't be done. Now, before we get to the next step, what is Paro actually saying? Why does Paro say, why he agrees to do it, but only inside the land? So I think we would all agree, I presume, and what Paro was saying is, listen, you're going to go out 3 days into the desert. Who knows what's going to be? Maybe you'll decide not to come back. And the student, that's us, remembers that when Yaakov runs away from Lavan, he's a 3-day distance from Lavan when he decides to run away. The story of Yaakov in the house of Lavan and the story of Israel and Egypt, of course, are parallel stories. So Paro has reason to suspect that if all the Israelites go off into the desert for a 3-day journey, maybe they will decide not to return. So Paro says to Moshe, okay, you want to bring your sacrifice? You can do it, but only inside the land of Egypt. So you can't run away. So presumably Paro's concession, of course, will change his mind afterwards, but Paro's concession is a demonstration that what he's concerned about is, well, it might be two things. One is that they'll run away, and the other could be a different reason. Because remember earlier when Moshe said we want to go for a 3-day journey into the desert, Paro said to Moshe, we can't afford that. There are too many Hebrews working for us. We're going to shut down all of our activities. 3-day journey into the desert is 6 days. Now let's say there's a day, it's a whole week. We can't afford that kind of thing. So on the other hand, if you just bring the sacrifice in Mitzrayim, you're cutting out the 6 days where there's no labor. So perhaps that's what's motivating Paro. So there are two possibilities here. Each of them, I think, is totally reasonable. But I mean, reasonable in the sense that it makes sense. This is what Paro was thinking. Either he wants to cut out all these extra days where they don't work, or he's afraid they will run away. So Moshe says, very nice, we can't do that. That's not possible. It's impossible to bring a sacrifice inside the land of Egypt. Let's keep reading. Scroll down, and Moshe says, Derech Shloshet Yamim Nelech Bamidbar Zavachnu Hashem Eloheinu Kasher Yomar Eloheinu. No, we have to go for a 3-day journey into the desert. We will bring sacrifices to our God, Kasher Yomar Eloheinu, as our God will instruct us. Notice, by the way, he didn't say Kasher Omar Eloheinu. He said Kasher Yomar Eloheinu. In other words, this is a side point, but an important one. What Moshe says is, we're going to go 3 days, we're going to bring sacrifices to God. We're not exactly sure what we're going to do. Knows exactly how many sacrifices, exactly how it's done. This is our God. We're waiting for further instruction. But that we have to sacrifice to God to demonstrate our subservience to God. Right? A zevach, by the way, is a sacrifice typically that the one who brings it also participates in it, that is, eats it. A zevach, sometimes it's called a korban shlamim. In any event, Moshe insists on the 3-day journey. We can't do it in Mitzrayim. We'll bring sacrifices to our God as our God will instruct us. So Moshe sticks to his original request of the 3-day journey into the desert. Paro had said you can bring sacrifices, but only inside the land. And now we come to a critical verse. Verse number 24. Vayome Paro, Anochi ashalach eschem, uzvachtem Hashem Elohechem bamidbar, ra'karcheko tarchichu lolechet, hatiru ba'adi. I find this verse to be a very interesting verse for our purposes. Paro says to Moshe, I will send you. You can bring your sacrifices to your God, Hashem. Paro now recognizes this name, Hashem. You can bring sacrifices in the desert, not in the land of Egypt. I understand. You can't slaughter the animals before the Egyptians when they can see it. But, harcheko tarchichu lolechet, don't go too far. And then he added, Hatiru Ba'adi, pray for me. Entreat God for me. So what does it mean, Harcheko Tarchiku Alechet? That's very important. What does it mean? You can bring the sacrifices, but don't go too far. So my suggestion is, Harcheko Tarchiku Alechet, for Paro solves both problems. In other words, not going too far. He doesn't say what that means. Maybe it means a third of a mile. Maybe it means a 1 hour journey. We can't do it before the Egyptians. Okay, go to the desert. There are no Egyptians in the desert, but not that far. And this way, if you don't go that far, you won't be able to run away. If Moshe's plan, this is the question. What is Moshe thinking about this 3-day journey? Is the 3-day journey a pretext? They'll go for 3 days and they're not going to come back and be slaves. They're going to run away from there, exactly as Paro suspects. Or no, it's not about the 3-day journey. It's not so much to run away. It is to distance themselves from Mitzrayim, to get a sense they are a separate people, a unique and separate people. But Moshe does not have the intention to bring the sacrifices and run away, but rather he actually plans to come back to Mitzrayim. Which of these two is it? And my approach, others disagree with me, but my approach is that this particular verse is very striking. Because if Moshe's real idea was to sacrifice in the desert and run away, what Paro seems to be saying over here is, you can bring your sacrifices, and it can't be in Mitzrayim, I accept that, but it can't be in a place that you're too far. Because if you go far away, you may keep going. So he doesn't say how much that is. Is it half a day? Is it 1 hour? Is it 6 hours? Who knows? But the point is, what Paro is ensuring, I believe, is the impossibility of running away, or extremely difficult to run away. And let's see if Moshe agrees. If Moshe says that's fine, we can do it. As long as the Egyptians don't see us, we're totally fine. That suggests to me that Moshe's request is not about running away. It's about something else. It's about the necessity to serve God. I'm not suggesting that he would bring the sacrifices and he's not thinking about leaving Mitzrayim, because we know his mission is to leave Mitzrayim. He was told explicitly to take the people out of Mitzrayim and to bring them to God's land, Eretz Tovah Rechava, etc. That's the mission. But it doesn't mean you have to do it all in one shot. It means you take one step at a time. And the first step, in my opinion, is to form amongst these people who came down as families and who lose their identity through the slavery, to reconstitute in them, to develop in them a sense of community. And a definition of community in the book of Exodus is a people that serve God. That's what we have with this request. That's what we have at the end of the book, where the formation of the nation is the people that dwell around God's house, God's temple, God's mishkan that they build. V'shachanti b'tocham. That's the definition of peoplehood in the book of Exodus. Later in the Bible, there may be other definitions. The request for a king suggests a different definition. That's not for now. But over here, let's see what Moshe says. The request, you can do it. Just make sure you don't. I want to make sure we keep an eye on you in the sense that you can't leave. Pray for me, he says. Pray for me to remove this arol, which is a terrible plague. So let's now see Moshe's request, and I'll stop and take any comments or questions. In the next verse, Vayoma Moshe, Hinei anochi yotzei meimach, v'tarti el Hashem. I'm going to leave you. I will entreat God. I'll pray for God. The sar ha'arol, and this arol, the swarms, will depart. Mi paro, me avada, me amo machar, and tomorrow they're all going to leave. Raka Yosef Paro Hateo Livilti Shalach et Ha'am L'Zborach Hashem. I'm going to do all this. The plague will depart, but Paro, do not continue Hateo. Hateo is to mock, right? But it's a verb that appeared, by the way, in the Yaakov Lavan story as well. Avichem Hetel Bi. All the parallels of Yaakov in the house of Lavan and Israel and Egypt. This is another one, the word Hatel. So what is Moshe saying over here? Moshe says, fine. I accept your request. I'm going to leave you. I'll take away the plague. We're going to march out of Egypt. Just a little journey down the road, not too far. We can't go anyplace. Moshe says, okay. If Moshe's whole request was to run away, you need 3 days. How could he possibly accept this? How could he accept this? He could have said, no, we need 3 days. I'm very sorry. He doesn't say this. He accepts Paro's request. That says to me that the plan is not to immediately run away. The plan is to first sacrifice, and that sacrifice will create a sense of community, of identity amongst the people. And then, at some point in the future, we'll take the next step and depart from Egypt. So, of course, we know what happens. It always happens. Moshe does what Moshe says Moshe will do. And then Paro, of course, hardens his heart and does not do what Paro said he would do. That's the end of the last verses of chapter 8. Moshe prays to God. Well, don't want to discuss it now, but the word for prayer over here, it's interesting that the Torah uses. There are many words for prayer in the Bible, but the word over here that appears many times is the word ayin taf resh, ata, or atira. That's an interesting word. Let's leave that for now, but we'll come back to that. The Moshe does pray to God, pleads with God. They translate Vayetaro Hashem. And in fact, Vayas Hashem Kidvar Moshe. Vayaser Ha'arov Miparo Me'avadavu Me'amo Om Nishar Echad. So they're all gone. God responds to Moshe's prayer. Moshe did what Moshe said he would do. But then the last verse, Vayachbei Paro et libo Gam bapam hazot v'lo shilach et ha'am. Paro hardens his heart. He does not send the people. Now, let me stop at this point. I think this actually is, to me, a very, very crucial point about the story in general as to what Moshe's thinking is about this idea of going into the desert to serve God. Is it simply a kind of preliminary step and they actually come back to Mitzrayim and resume the slavery? Sounds crazy, but I think that's the pshat. Well, no. Moshe actually wants to run away. Then you have to figure out if he wants to run away. Why does he accept this proposal? Someone suggested to me, well, he knows that power is going to change his mind. That doesn't seem to work for me in the story. Yes, God did say to Moshe that power is not going to accept what you say. Moshe is told that from the very beginning. That doesn't necessarily mean, in my opinion, that Moshe fully processes that. For example, when Moshe first goes to Paro, he comes back to God, and Paro made it worse. And Moshe complains, Lama Hariota, why did you make things worse? And then Moshe added, V'yatzel lo itzalta, you didn't save your people. And God says, you'll see what I'm going to do. God could have said, I've already told you that. Didn't I tell you in the very beginning, when you're listening to what I said? It's not going to be a simple matter. He's not going to listen to you in the beginning. Yes, it's true, as the Ramban points out. Moshe says, not didn't listen, you made it worse. But then Moshe said, you didn't save your people. But he was told from the very beginning. Being told something and actually fully integrating it into your consciousness are two different things. Our father Abraham was told by God explicitly in chapter 17 of Breshit, your wife Sarah will have a child, and this will be the covenantal child, your covenantal child. That's Sarah, your wife. We call her Sarah now. Ishmael, he's going to be okay. Yes, I understand you're concerned about Ishmael, but that's chapter 17 of the book of Breshit. You can't be more clear than that. And in chapter 20, Abraham goes to the town of Gerar and says, she's my sister, and Sarah's taken. And the reader, we scratch our head and we say, what? How could he possibly allow Sarah to be taken after he was told explicitly that this woman is your covenantal partner, and you two will together produce the covenantal heir? Well, what do you mean? How is that possible? And I think that's the way the Torah works. We can't assume because God says something to somebody that person fully understands or accepts what God is saying. I think it's pretty clear that Abraham, the great hero of the story, does not yet fully comprehend what God is saying. No. And that's part of this. He learns it eventually. Ishmael is sent away. We have the Akedah. So I don't think, yes, Moshe was certainly told. Doesn't mean Moshe fully comprehends. I don't think that's how the story works. That's my opinion. Let me stop here for a moment before we get to the next two more plays. Hope we get to them both. But if there are any comments or questions, I'd like to hear. And please speak up.
Yeah, I think that we can understand when Moshe says he's ready to go out and come back, because he knows that he has to prepare these people for going out, and this is just one act of uniting them. They're going out as a group, and they're coming back. And we know that they're not, they need a long time to be prepared, because even in the end, we eat matzah because they weren't perfectly prepared.
Exactly. I think that, exactly. And the point being that to create a sense of peoplehood, to create a sense of mutual responsibility, it does not happen. When you're a slave, basically, you don't have any ability to really to reach out to others. You are very much a individual person without no sense of community as possible. You don't even have your own, you can't manage your own time. So I think the process of creating a people takes a lot of time. And as you say, it could even be that even after we leave Mitzrayim, there's not yet fully a sense of kind of communal responsibility. So for sure, I think as we're in agreement that basically this is one step towards a sense of community, which in the book of Shemot is defined as the people that experience some kind of revelation together. That's why the story, we'll get to the Korban Pesach. God will appear that night in Mitzrayim, and there's a sense of the house. You have your house, and your house joins with the next house. It's not even the full community in a sense yet, but it's moving towards. It's not just a family either. It's family moving towards community. I think that's central. And as you say, I think this theme of peoplehood having a real sense of connectedness is something which takes a lot of time. I would just say, tonight is Yom HaZikaron, and then we have Yom HaAtzmaut, and all that's been going on these last many months with the war in Israel and Israel defending itself. And there is, I think, one of the big questions and one of the most troubling concerns that I have has to do with here in the United States, that among many of our own Jews, there's not a full sense of connectedness to the Jewish people, a sense that we are one people. Yes, we care about the world. Yes, we contribute to the world, to all kinds of things, but there's also an entity called the Jewish people. These are our brothers and sisters, and we are mutually responsible for each other. And I think in some quarters, that idea, which is central to our study, unfortunately seems to have been forgotten. I think that I find that to be an extraordinarily troubling phenomenon. And I think we see this in many quarters. It probably was always there, but it's coming out now. And when, I think it's something that has to be thought about very deeply, and how we can move towards a better sense of mutual commitment, understanding that we are responsible, maybe for the world, but it starts with your own people. And I think that's unfortunately, in many quarters, seems to be sorely missing. But in terms of the story, this is exactly the story of the Exodus. It's about forming a nation. We came down, we was enslaved, and slaves can lose a sense of their identity. And Moshe's role was to give the people a sense of their own identity. In this book, actually, which is probably the happiest book of the Bible, I mean, it ends on a very high note. It ends with the people coming together, building the Mishkan together. God dwells amongst us. God is guiding us through the desert. I mean, later we, of course, run into many problems, but this is the trajectory of the book, moving from slavery to freedom. A sense of freedom means also responsibility, and I think that's central to the book. I see there was another question here.
Yes.
Yes.
I have a question from chat.
Rabbi Silber. The interpretation that What Moshe has in mind is identity formation. That seems to be supported by the fact that Pharaoh himself may suspect that or may intuit that, because he adds, but don't forget me, in forming your own separate identity, think of me.
Right. Yeah, that's certainly possible, right? I mean, rulers and despots have been known to think primarily about themselves. That is certainly the case. Yeah, for sure. I do think this is the core issue of the book, and I think it is. I think this whole question of what makes us a people, I think, is something we think about very, very deeply. It's not obvious, and I already mentioned that in Sefer Shmuel, it's one thing. In Sefer, in the book of Shmuel, it may be something very different. The idea of a nation, the idea of having a kind of mutual responsibility, in the sense that we have an army. The army can defend us. So any of us is attacked, that the army can respond. The idea that there's a kind of central, there are laws that are administered by people. There's an administration. There are many different ways to define what it means to be a nation. And as I was discussing with my wife yesterday, I was giving a session on this in the foundation tonight. Different people have different understandings of what it means to be a people. I think it's very important for all of us to know that other people may see peoplehood very differently than we do. Different people have different definitions of for example, what makes one a Jew. I think that's a very, very important point to take note of, and to understand that other people may have a different understanding of what it means to be Jewish. But whatever it means to be Jewish, I think we should, in the broadest sense, be able to reach out to all those who see themselves as Jewish, and we're all part of one people, even if we have very different understandings. There was a question in the chat, I think, from Ruth. Is that true?
Mm.
Yes, there was a chat question or comment.
Yes.
I saw Ruth raised it. Yeah.
It's from Ruth Reisner. She
ahead.
says, Paro placed his request for Moshe's prayer after he granted permission for Bnei Israel to leave and sacrifice to Hashem. Moshe seems to have weakened his own leverage by first praying to Hashem to lift the plague. It sounds like Paro's intention was that Moshe pray on behalf while the sacrifices were taking place.
That's an interesting point. I hadn't thought about that. That's possible. That is a possibility. I didn't even think of that possibility. But then Moshe would be actually doing better than Paro. Moshe would then be separating those two things. He prays for Paro. He prays for Paro after Paro has given permission. So I'm not sure about that. But maybe a related point. I'm not sure it's a related point. Is what I pointed out earlier, where Moshe said to Paro, "We're going to go serve God, and we're going to do what God tells us to do." In other words, and Moshe had said this earlier, by the way. Moshe says explicitly, we're going to serve God, but we don't know exactly how we're going to serve God until we get there. I remember many years ago, Zalman Schechter or Shalomi, from the Reconstructionist, interesting character, and he made this point that when it comes to prayer, Moshe says to Paro, "Listen, but we're going to go pray. We don't know what's going to be yet. How can you? What are you going to pray tomorrow?" Says Moshe. How do we know? Till we get to that place. How do we know how we're going to daven? Because nowadays we know exactly how we're going to daven. People go to shul, and they know exactly what they're going to say. They know what time they're going to start. They know what time they're going to finish. They know what time the rabbi is going to speak. They know what time the kiddush is. So there are no surprises, and that's a problem actually. But Moshe is saying to Paro, he said it before and he says it again. Who knows what's going to be? So it's certainly possible, that it's possible that Ruth's comment is appropriate, in the sense that maybe when you're having this whole procedure, include me as well. And then, because you don't know what it's going to be, maybe what kind of prayer service you'll have, what kind of sacrificial service you're going to have. How do you know till you get there? And but then Moshe does, of course, pray to Paro right away. Suggests that in Moshe's head, it's Paro is saying Paro doesn't want to wait. Meanwhile, because the plague is now, so Moshe understands if the plague is now, probably Paro wants the plague to end as soon as possible. Therefore, he doesn't wait for the sacrificial prayer service, which is going to be later, whatever the journey is, 6 hours, 10 hours, whatever, but he prays right away. Is there any other question? I think Sandra had a question.
Yes, Sandra.
Yes, thank you, Kayla. Thank you, Rabbi. So just harking back to Avraham and Avimelech for a moment in terms of similarity here. When Avimelech complains to Avraham, claims he's innocent and says, I didn't do anything. And then he basically asks, doesn't he ask Abraham similarly to what Pharaoh asks Moshe? Doesn't he ask him, intercede on my behalf, call off your God? Because God had closed the wombs, whatever the Midrash also
He doesn't
says.
ask it. No, he doesn't.
Or
God
does
says to
Abraham do
Avimelech.
it by himself?
God says to Avimelech. Let me just take two, because the Avimelech is very interesting in that context. First of all, what God says to Avimelech is, return this man's wife.
Right.
She's a married woman. Then God adds, and if you don't do it, I'm going to kill you. Now, the point is, that's not the way God talks to righteous people. The way God talks to Paro. You do it, Moshe, you do it, or else. That's number one. And then God added and said, return the man's wife. He's a prophet. He will pray for you. So actually, it never says that Avimelech asked him to pray. It says that God said to Avimelech, Avram will pray. But that is also interesting that you have another parallel there. That's a good point. There's a parallel between Avram praying for Avimelech and Moshe praying for Paro. The point in the Avimelech story, though, is a different point, which is, I don't want to get too into the Avimelech story, but it's a very interesting point, and that is when Avimelech, after he grabs Sarah, so God threatens Avimelech, and Avimelech says, "What do you? Would you kill even a righteous nation?" Referring to himself, he said, she said, everybody's guilty but me. And God says to Avimelech, listen, I know exactly how righteous you are. That's why I'm trying to help you out. Return her, and if you don't return her, I'm gonna kill you and everything you possess. And Abraham is going to pray for you. He's a prophet, and that is actually very interesting, because what God is saying is, Avimelech says, listen, what kind of God are you? You'll kill even the righteous? That's in chapter 20. In chapter 18, that's exactly what our patriarch Abraham said to God. Would you slay the righteous, right? Abraham prays for Sodom at the end of chapter 18. Right? After sped tzadikim rasha. So they both say the same thing. The difference is Abimelech talks about himself. And God says to Abimelech, you're righteous, you're a tzaddik. Let me tell you what kind of tzaddik you are. You're a tzaddik that if you were in Sodom, Abraham's prayers would have saved you. That's what kind of tzaddik you are. That's not exactly it. I mean, Lot gets saved on account of Abraham's prayers. God remembers Abraham. That's what kind of tzaddik. Let's not get carried away. You're a tzaddik. You don't tzaddik, okay? But true, if Abraham intercedes on your behalf, unlike the people of Sodom that he couldn't save, he will save you. That's the point over there. Okay, let us now.
My question is, Rabbi, thank you. Is one of the points of whether God or Pharaoh asks the righteous, the prophet, to pray for him, is one of the points somehow to, what's the word, demonstrate to the tyrant, whether the tyrant is Pharaoh or Avimelech, to somehow demonstrate to the tyrant that this man in front of you, who's acting very civil and very correct and is having a normal conversation with you, this person possesses powers, and you really have to pay special attention to him. In other words, it's another level of azhara, it's another level of warning to this person who doesn't hear it, doesn't see it, doesn't pay attention.
I think so. I think what's clear is that for whatever reason, this God is a powerful God, and Moshe has access.
That's what I'm saying.
He has no access. So to that extent, he has power. If you have access to power, you have power. And that is certainly the case over here. Nonetheless, at the end of the day, once again, he hardens his heart. He does not send the people out. So this is what I had to say. This is
Can
the
I
fourth
ask you
plague.
something?
Yes.
You bring up when there are echoes of other places. Well, Vatishachet Haaretz is an echo of the Mabul. It says Vatishachet Haaretz there too. And I want to know what you made of that.
I will make a lot of it, but later on, of course. The Mabul, let's put it this way, okay? I'm not going to directly respond because it's a big topic. But let's not
Okay.
forget one thing. Let me just make one point about the way the Bible works, the way the Torah works. The book of Breshit is about the patriarchal covenant being passed down from generation. That's the main focus of Sefer Breshit. You have a covenant, and the difficulty in transmitting the covenant from generation to generation. And the people, Rebecca understands how it works, Sarah understands how it works, Abraham and Yitzhak don't seem to initially understand it. The conflicts between those who might be the recipient of the covenantal blessing, that's the main focus in Sefer Breshit, but it's not how the book starts. The book starts with creation stories, and creation, and the creation stories come in several different forms. There's the first account of creation, there's the second account of creation, then there's the recreation of the world in the story of Noah. The world is destroyed and then recreated, and then without getting into it now, that the creation narrative continues, I would say at least up to the Akedah. So apart from the patriarchal narrative, you have a creation narrative. Now, if you think about the story of, that's what Sefer Breshit is about, okay? It's the creation narrative, but the patriarchal narrative is sort of embedded in the creation narrative. Now, when you get to the second book of the Torah, the book of Shemot, and as we studied back when, you can't miss the fact that in the beginning of Sefer Shemot, all the language is language borrowed, first of all, from the story of creation, Paru, Vayishritzu, Vayirbu, and all that in the very beginning of the book. And then the second chapter of the book, you have a story which
With
our
the tape.
hero, exactly, is put inside an ark and is going to be saved if put inside an ark. So the fact of the matter is that this book of Exodus, one might say, is about also a creation story, not a creation of the world, a creation of this nation. You can't miss the fact that in the first chapter of the Bible, first chapter of the Torah, you end with the creation of the whole world, and the capstone is the Shabbat. The Shabbat is the capstone of the creation in the first chapter of the Torah. You can't miss the fact that the Shabbat is the absolutely central mitzvah in the book of Exodus, and the Torah ends with Shabbat, basically. The Mishkan is connected to Shabbat, both in the instruction and the actual building. So there are all kinds of links between the story of Moshe and Noah comes up later on in a central passage in the book, but I don't want to jump the gun over here. But the larger point that when you're reading the book of Exodus and the major themes of Exodus, we of course have to keep in mind all the time the story of Genesis, and that the Mishkan is completely, the language of the Mishkan is totally taken from the creation stories. And therefore, we have to ask ourselves the question, given that fact, and it is a fact, what do we make of it? What I make of it is that the theme of Exodus is also creation. It's the creation of this particular people. And we have to bear that in mind all along and see how the book of Shemot will use the stories of Breshit. In the case of Moshe, a kind of Noach figure, we'll see this later on, how the Torah very clearly is making reference to the story of Noach when it talks about Moshe and making distinctions between them, which is very interesting. So all that is for later on. We'll hopefully get there as we learn together. Okay, this is the fourth plague. There's always more to say. This is what I want to emphasize about plague number 4. I want to do 5, and so let's get to plague number 5. Plague 7 is, I'm not sure we're going to get to today. Plague number 7 is a very important central plague. It's probably the central plague, but let's get to plague number 5, which is chapter 9. And plague number 5, again, Vayomer Hashem el Moshe bo el Paro, v'dibarto elav kol ma Hashem Elohi ha'ivrim, shalach et ami v'yavduni, the same kind of theme once again, send the people to serve me. That's God's motivation, to serve me. That's the goal. Interesting, because we would have said the goal was to give us freedom. The goal of the Exodus story, the goal for the Ivrim is to be a free people, and that is a goal. I'm not saying it's not a goal, but that's not the primary focus over here. It's not to free them. One might say it's even to enslave them to a different master, which, as I said before, gives you a certain amount of freedom. That is true. But we have to take note of the fact The stated objective is Shalach Ami V'Yavdu. Fine. Once again, there's again a warning, because before the first two of this set, there's always a warning. In the third one, there's no warning. And here, we have the following. If you refuse, and you're still holding on to them, basusim, bachamorim, bagmarim, babakar, batzon, dever kovein ba'od. And once again, v'yifro Hashem bein miknei Yisrael bein miknei Mitzrayim v'yamus mikol v'bnei Yisrael davar. V'yosem Hashem oedu leimor machar yaseh Hashem hadavar hazeh ba'aretz. V'yas Hashem et hadavar hazeh b'macharat v'yomot kol miknei Mitzrayim u'b'miknei b'nei Yisrael l'meit echad. Fine. Now, here we have the fifth plague. The fifth plague is Dever. Dever. Dever is pestilence, Dever is plague, called the Magefa. And we remember, and this is an important point, that when Moshe first goes to Paro and requests that the people be allowed to serve God in the desert for 3 days, and Moshe said to Paro, the God of the Hebrews has appeared to us and demands that we serve God. Pen yifgaenu ba'dever o ba'cheref. Lest this God smite us with dever and cheref. That's found earlier in chapter 5, earlier on. So we have to go serve our God. Otherwise, our God will get angry and God will smite us. Yifgaenu ba'dever o ba'cheref. With dever, pestilence, and with sword.
Rabbi Silber?
Yes.
I wanted to just say, it's funny. I never.
We'll just find that verse. I'll take it in a second. This chapter 5, verse number 3. Chapter 5, verse 3 is the verse. Yes, please speak.
No, I just wanted to say that, well, I never saw that language before, except for Eitz Chaim here, Lamacha Zikim Ba. And here we have Lamacha Zikim Bam. It was just like, I was just seeing.
We have it elsewhere too. We do have it elsewhere as well. It's not only there. Yes, that's true.
Right.
We have it in some other places as well.
Right. But it's the opposite. Isn't it the opposite? This is the bad Macha Zikim Ba.
No, this is negative. You're holding on to them. You refuse to let them go.
But the other one is the opposite, the Eitz Chaim.
Right, but it appears in other places as well where it's also negative.
Right.
You have it with Amnon and Tamar. He grabs onto her. You have it in negative and positive. You have it in depends where your context. Dever and Cheref. Well, when Moshe says to Paro, we better serve our God, lest God smite us by Dever uba Cheref. Now, of course, as the commentaries point out, us can mean all of us. Us means Moshe, my people, and frankly, Paro, it could be you as well. Or even more than that, it could be fundamentally you, but Moshe doesn't want to say you, so Moshe says us. But the sense is clear. You better let us go. Otherwise, God will smite you with Dever and Cheref. Now, one of the points, I may have mentioned this last week, I don't remember, the Haggadah, I spoke about, I write about it in some ways, that Dever and Cheref, as the Haggadah understands it, Dever is in fact the fifth plague. This is plague number 5. Cheref, presumably, is the 10th plague, Makat Bechorot. It doesn't mean that there's someone with a sword killing the Egyptians. Cherev just means destruction. And in fact, if you remember the Haggadah comments, the Haggadah says, the Haggadah makes the comment, Yod Chazaka uvizro netuya. Remember the Haggadah? Uvizro netuya, what does the Haggadah say? So Hacherev. Dever is the first one. Yod Chazaka is Dever. Yod Chazaka is Dever. And the reason Yod Chazaka is Dever, we just read it, notice that the only plague that uses the term Yad Hashem is Dever. No other plague. Yad Hashem Hoyab Mikdachat. The Haggadah cites that verse. And it's true. It's the only one of the 10 plagues of which the Yad Hashem appears. So Yod Chazaka Zoa Dever. But Zero and Netuya Zoa Cherev. Right? Zero and Netuya is Cherev. And they cite a verse. What is the verse that they cite? Who remembers that from the Haggadah? I know Pesach's a long time ago. But what
something
is
on Yerushalayim?
Yes. Yad Hashem, right?
Yad Hashem Hayom.
Yad Hashem, something Netuya Yerushalayim. No, Charbosh rufa biyado netuya al Yerushalayim. Charbosh, what is that referring to? Charbosh rufa biyado, the hand, the sword was in the outstretched hand, held over Jerusalem.
Is it
Where
from
is that
Yoel?
verse from?
Yoel?
No, it's not. The next verse is from Yoel. No, that's a verse from Chronicles. That's the story in which King David counts the people. David takes a census of the people. David takes a census of the people and recognizes that it's a grievous sin to count the people. And the prophet goes to David. The story is found in Shmuel, in the last chapter of Shmuel, and also in Divrei Hayamim. And in Divrei Hayamim, it says that David is given three choices. What do you want? Do you want famine? Do you want war? Or do you want dever? And David's response, Vayom David el Hashem tzari ma'od, niplana biyad Hashem. I want to be in God's hands. So he rules out the war. But of the other two, God, you make the choice, not me. You choose. And God sends dever. And God sent the third, dever. Because when you count the people, we read Lo tia magefa negef bifkodota. But my point is, Charbosh hufa b'yado netuya Yerushalayim. The angel, David sees the angel's outstretched hand over Jerusalem. God tells the angel to hold your hand back. But the point of the cherev in the story of Divrei Hayamim, it doesn't mean the angel's killing people b'cherev. It's explicit that's not the case. The angel, God is killing the people by dever. Dever. My point is, cherev here, the Haggadah is making the point, by dever or b'cherev, that dever is the fifth plague is Yad Hashem, it's plague number 5, where the animals are killed. But the 10th plague is called cherev. Not that the sword is literally employed. The sword is figuratively employed. Because in the case of the verse that's cited, it's not cherev, it's actually dever. It's plague. They died with a plague in the David story. But cherev, but here's my point being that when Moshe said to Paro, you better let us go, lest God smite us with dever and cherev, already there's a warning to Paro about what's going to happen. And the warning is, let me tell you something, Paro. They're going to be plagues. One set and another set. One set of 5 and another set of 5. So the 10 commandments, the 2 luchot, they're 5 and 5. That a way to divide the plagues is not just 3, 3, 3, and 1, or 3, 3, and 4. But another way to divide the plagues is 5 and 5. The first set of 5 concludes with dever, which is deadly, but just for the animals. That's dever. But the second set of 5 concludes with cherev, and that's what Paro was warned about when Moshe initially says to Paro, "You better let us go." Pen yifkaenu b'dever or b'cherev. Now, what's very interesting is just a small digression here, related, but and that is when you read the story of when you read the Haggadah, and the Haggadah has these midrashim, has these 4 verses, and then it breaks up each of the verses, and it makes a midrashic comment. So, for example, the last of the 4 verses, God took us out of Egypt. So the medrash of the Haggadah comments, is dever, right? The dever which King David, the people under King David's rule suffered dever. That's parallel to that's dever. That's Yod Chazaka's dever, and they cite the verse from our story of dever. And then draw on the tuya, that's cherev. And my point is twofold. First of all, what the midrash gets you to do, we can't do this now, unfortunately. I wrote about this in the Haggadah. It's one of my favorite things that I wrote in the Haggadah. Because when you actually look at the story of David's census, and you look at the story, our chapter of Dever over here, the 5th plague of Dever, you notice something very striking. And that is, it's not just, in other words, you notice that actually when you read what happens in the David story, both in, let's say, the book of Samuel, the last chapter of Shmuel, you notice that the language of the Dever in the David story is completely lifted from the 5th plague. For example, in the David story, you have a play in that story on 2 words, dever and the word davar. Dever and davar. Here too, you have dever and davar. You have the word dever, right? The 5th plague is dever. And then we go to our chapter, you have three different times, right? V'yamut livnei Yisrael davar. Machar yaseh Hashem hadavar hazeh ba'aretz. In verse number, what was it? Verse number 5. Then you have in verse number 6, Vayashem et hadavar hazeh. So you have dever, and followed three times right away with the word davar. And not only that, Paro was told it's going to happen in Lamoed. When you open up the book of Shmuel and you read the story of the dever, you see it's exactly the same thing. That the book of Shmuel uses dever, but then it describes it as davar multiple times. And the warning is it's going to happen li'et moed. It's going to happen at an appointed time. So you see the parallels between them. And as I mentioned, Nipuna biyad Hashem. Yad Hashem is found in the David story. And Dever is the only plague in which the focus is on Yad Hashem. And then the question becomes, what is the point? And the point that I make in the Haggadah is the following point, which is that on the night of Pesach, we are completely focused on our deliverance from our enemy. The enemy is Paro, and we are completely connecting ourselves to the experience of the Jewish people in the land of Egypt, to the extent that Haggadah makes the remarkable statement that B'chol dar v'dor chayav adam ro'ot et atzmo ki hu yatzah mitzrayim. We have to see ourselves as actually there, not just reading about history. We are there. We are there with them. That's very important. But that does not contradict another point for the Haggadah, which the Medrash is making. This Paro's the bad guy, and we are together with Israel, and all of that's true, 100% true. But let me tell you something, says the Medrash. If you think it's only possible for Paro to behave this way, you've got another thing coming. Because the point of when David takes the census, which is a grievous crime of state, what is David saying? These are my people. That's the great sin. The kings can think that people are their people. And once a king thinks that way, the king is thinking like Paro. And it's very interesting when you open up that chapter 24 of Shmuel, and David decides to take the census for no good reason, but to demonstrate his power. And Yoav, if you remember the story, Yoav says to him, don't do it. Don't do it. Yoav doesn't say, well, it's a bad idea, don't do it. He has his reasons, his religious reasons, his practical reasons, whatever. Vayechazak David al Yoav. But David insists, and the book of Shmuel uses Vayechazak. The word Vayechazak, of course, when you're thinking about Paro, Vayechazek Hashem et Reifo, Vayechazek et Libo, right? So the point is that God is making a simple statement. We are totally focused, and appropriately, on what happened to the Israelites in the land of Egypt. We are with them in their suffering. Tonight it is Yom HaZikaron. We've lost about 800 soldiers in Israel, not to speak of all the people murdered on October 7th. And next day we are Yom HaSmut, which is a day of gratitude, basically. That's what the day is. We're grateful we have this miracle called Israel. But that's not to say that we don't recognize any problems. No one ever suggested that we are perfect. We know what people are capable of. And therefore, even at the Seder, the Medrash says, listen, if you think that only Paro is capable, you have another thing coming. Now, there's a difference between David and Paro. And the difference is this, that when it comes to Paro, he's constantly changing his mind. Yes, I'll do this. Yes, I'll do this. Yes. Hatiru. The word Hatiru appears 8 times. And of course, he never repents. He always goes back. How does the book of Shmuel end, actually? Remember how the book of Shmuel ends? That last verse? Vayatar David el Hashem. David actually confesses. David's confession. That's the difference. People make mistakes. David confession. And there you have the word Vayatar. It's so striking. So you have this basically a story, chapter 24, which relates to Dever, which is the 5th plague. What I like about that particular, that's not the main thing I say about that chapter. There are many other things about that chapter, which are some of the better stuff, but also in the new book in Hebrew, Malchut Adam, I talk about it at length, that chapter. It's a very important chapter. But even at the night of the Seder, you know what I mean? Even at the night of the Seder, I would say one other thing about the Seder, about Pesach. and thinking about the Haggadah and thinking about what it means to be a Jew and connecting to Jewish experience. It's I'll leave it for now. I'll get back to that later on. But in any event, let's continue now. So we have this is the fifth plague. This is Dever. This is a serious plague because this is it's a deadly plague. And again, once Paro finds out, Moshe once again intercedes, right? Well, it doesn't even say intercedes. Vayishlach Paro, it says, Vayachbed lev Paro, v'lo shilach et ha'am. Once again, Paro is hardening his heart. Kaved, that's another, of course, key word over here. He refuses to send the people. So again, the point I wanted to emphasize for our purposes here is that this is part of the initial warning to Paro. Pen yifka'enu ba'dever o ba'cherev. 5 plagues and 5 plagues. Okay, so we touched upon so far plague number 4 and plague number 5. I had hoped we would get into plague number 7. Let me say just one word, and then I'll stop and take comments or questions. We noticed last week, in terms of the 2 Psalms, Psalm 78, Psalm 105, that one of the Psalms certainly has seven plagues. That one Psalm leaves out plagues 3, 6, and 9. Because those are plagues that essentially in the Chumash are responses to the not keeping Paro's word on the first 2 of the set. There are 3 sets of 3. So 1 and 2, and then 3, there's no warning for 3. Because 3 is a punishment for violation of 1 and 2. The same with 6, the same with 9. And one of the Psalms left out 3, 6, and 9. The other Psalm was more complicated, but the question is how to count up the plagues. So one Psalm certainly has 7 plagues. The other Psalm, Sarna thinks it has 7. I suggest it has 1 plus 7. But in any event, the number 7 is a critical number in the 2 Psalms, and it's not that surprising. The number 7 is a critical number throughout the Torah. So it's not that surprising, actually. And then thinking about the plagues, let's see about plague number 10. Of the 9 plagues, if I had to pick out one plague that is the most significant plague, I would say plague number 7. For one thing, as we'll see next week, it's actually the longest plague. The longest description of any plague is plague number 7. So it does require our special attention, and we'll start with plague number 7 next week. But let me stop here for a moment to take any comments or questions you might have. We have 2 or 3 minutes still.
Silber, what did you say the 2 to him are? Which ones? I'm so sorry to bother you.
78 and 105.
Okay.
These are 2 called so-called historical Psalms.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
In the 5th plague, all the animals are supposedly killed, but in the 6th plague, suddenly there are still animals. So
you asked that question. So Gail asked the question. You're in good company. You asked the question to Ibn Ezra. The Ibn Ezra answers it in one line. He says, something? Sometimes when it says kol, it doesn't mean kol. The Ibn says kol, it says one word, rov. Because he says exactly your point. In the next plague, it says, the 7th plague, it says those people who heeded God's word took their animals out of the field. Says the Ibn Ezra, what are animals? That all the animals died in the 5th plague. Says the Ibn Ezra, it doesn't mean all. It is hyperbolic language. By the way, we have that in many other places. It says everybody was killed. And then you see later on, they still seem to exist. You know what I mean? I mean, Shechem was totally massacred by the brothers. But later on, your brothers are in Shechem. Why not go visit them? And Shechem seems to exist throughout the whole Bible as a very central place. But everybody was killed. But you have this in many, many places. It's just hyperbolic language. That's exactly your point. Exactly word for word is what the Ibn Ezra says. He says it straight up. Exactly your point. He says in 7th plague, it says the people who feared God's word took their animals out of the field. What animals? It says they all died. Doesn't mean all. That's the Ibn Ezra. You're in good company. Anybody else for a comment or question? Thank you for that.
Is it hyperbolic that they talk about some of Menashe was able to go in and out of Mitzrayim? Is that completely false during the time they were in Mitzrayim? Is that a possibility?
There's no evidence in the text that any of that is true. There are many midrashim about what happened in Mitzrayim. There's a medrash that 4/5 of the Jews never left. It doesn't say that. Chamushim,
Right.
it doesn't. These are midrashim. Now, when you have a midrash like that, you always have to ask the question. At least I do. What is the midrash trying to say to me? What is the midrash trying to teach me? They don't take it literally, but what were they trying to say something? That's the language that they speak, and I think our approach, that I think is truthful, is to try to ask the question. Okay, it doesn't say it, but and probably that to be taken literally, but it are trying to teach us something. In the case of the 4/5, they're saying, to leave is not so simple. When someone says leave your home, we know how difficult it is, even under terrible circumstances, and we know from our own history, not that long ago during the Shoah, that some people just refuse to leave. You're used to it, you rationalize it, you don't recognize all the dangers. It's hard to leave a place that you grew up in. You have all kinds of connections to it. So the idea of just leaving Mitzrayim is not simple. And the fact of the matter is, the Torah says they didn't have bread, they had matzah. Ki garshu mi Mitzrayim v'lo yochlu hitmameya. We were thrown out of Egypt, we couldn't tarry, which suggests, of course, that had we been able to tarry, we might have tarried. And hitmameya might not just mean to tarry, to leave an hour later. Lot is mitmameya in Sodom. He has to be pulled out of Sodom. It's not so easy to leave even a bad place. In Sodom, they wanted to kill Lot, but he doesn't find it easy to leave. You have all kinds of connections. He has family there. There's all kinds of reasons for it. So that's in general, I think, that's my approach to the Midrash. What is it trying to teach me? That's how I see it. Any more comments? I'll have to stop in a minute. Next week, we'll start with chapter 7.
Laszlo, I saw you had a question.
Miot Chazoko, they are also Marzikim. Another connection with the word Marzikim indicates Miot Chazoko, they are.
No, for sure. I mean, right. But I would say about the cherev is that it doesn't mean literally a sword. It doesn't mean in the context a sword, because the cherev at Divrei Hayamim is not a sword. It's actually dever, is what it is over there. Okay, I'm wishing everyone a meaningful Yom HaZikaron and a happy Yom HaTzmaut. And I think that what we're learning here together, I think, is so relevant to our present situation as part of being part of the Jewish people. I think there's a lot to work towards, I think, in getting everybody to understand that we are people connected to each other and responsible for each other. Anyway,
may I add that Smichot Parshiot, I had the opportunity to stumble in to Drisha today. There were a bunch of women learning. I was going to Gush for the movie and the discussion, and Kol HaKavod. It was like the old sense of the old Drisha, people eating lunch and learning. Kol HaKavod.
No, the yeshiva is an amazing place. People should visit Israel. It's I think, the best thing Drisha's ever done. It's a yeshiva like the men's yeshivas. It's
right. It
raises
Israel.
the bar 100 levels. There's nothing like it, and it can have, if it really can grow, it can have a major impact and opportunities for women, and which is for the betterment of all the Jewish people. So it's a great place. There's no question. Okay, thank you very much. Looking forward to learning with you again. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming and learning. One programming note, Mishnah in Depth with Rabbi Avi Wallfish will not be meeting this afternoon, but we hope to see you and learn with you more in the week to come. Take care, everyone, and have a good day.
Right.
Also, happy Mother's Day.
Right, sure, right.